Blood stained the old man's porch, washing away in the freezing rain. Silas thought his days of saving lives ended decades ago, but a dying woman's midnight knock changed everything. He didn't know she belonged to the world's most dangerous biker gang until 800 roaring choppers surrounded his house. 72-year-old Silas Pendleton lived a life defined by silence. After 30 years as a trauma nurse in a chaotic emergency room, and another 4 years before that as a combat medic in Vietnam, Silas had seen enough blood, panic, and death to last a dozen lifetimes. When his beloved wife, Helen, passed away from pancreatic cancer 5 years ago, he packed up his life and moved to a remote off-the-grid cabin nestled deep in the Coconino National Forest of northern Arizona. His closest neighbor was 14 miles down a rutted dirt road. His only companion was a 3-legged golden retriever named Barnaby. That was exactly how Silas wanted it. On the night of October 14th, a torrential autumn storm battered the mountainside. The wind howled through the towering ponderosa pines, snapping branches and driving sheets of freezing rain against the cabin's thick log walls. The power grid had failed hours ago, leaving Silas reading a worn paperback by the dim, flickering light of a kerosene lantern. The fire in the hearth cracked and popped, fighting a losing battle against the biting draft slipping beneath the floorboards. Then Barnaby growled. It wasn't his usual lazy grumble at a passing raccoon. The dog's hackles raised, a ridge of coarse blonde fur standing on end as he limped toward the heavy oak front door, barking frantically into the storm. Silas set his book down, his heart adopting a steady, practiced rhythm. Out here, a knock in the middle of a tempest usually meant a stranded hiker or a lost hunter. But as Silas approached the door, a heavy, desperate thud rattled the wood, followed by a weak, agonizing scream. He threw the deadbolt and yanked the door open. A woman collapsed across the threshold, bringing the freezing rain and the scent of copper and wet leather into the cabin. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, and soaked to the bone. Her blonde hair was plastered to her pale face, but it was the dark, glistening stain spreading across her abdomen that made Silas's professional instincts instantly override his retirement. "Help," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper against the roaring wind. "They're coming." As Silas unzipped it to find the source of the bleeding, his breath caught in his throat. She was heavily pregnant, at least 7 months judging by the swell of her belly. But the blood wasn't coming from a pregnancy complication. It was welling up from a jagged, pulsating entry wound just below her right collarbone. The fabric of her white maternity shirt was scorched around the edges. It was a gunshot wound fired at terrifyingly close range. "Stay with me, sweetheart," Silas said, his voice dropping into the calm, authoritative baritone he had used to comfort hundreds of dying soldiers and patients. "I'm Silas. You're safe now. What's your name?" "Chloe," she gasped, her eyes rolling back. "My baby. Please. Your baby is going to be fine, and so are you. But I need to stop this bleeding." Silas's hands moved with muscle memory. He tore open a sterile trauma dressing and applied crushing pressure to her shoulder. Chloe screamed in agony, her back arching off the floor. As she writhed, the oversized leather jacket slipped off her shoulders, revealing the back of the garment. Silas froze for a fraction of a second. Sewn into the center of the leather was the iconic, terrifying Death's Head logo, a winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet. Above it, an upper rocker patch read Hell's Angels, and below it, Arizona. But it was the smaller patch on the breast pocket that sent a chill down Silas's spine. Property of Tommy Callahan, President. Silas knew the name. Everyone in the Southwest knew the name. Tommy, ironclad Callahan, was the ruthless president of the most violent Hell's Angels chapter in the region. He controlled the highways, the desert trade routes, and possessed a reputation for merciless retribution. And this dying, pregnant woman bleeding out on Silas's rug was his wife. "Chloe," Silas said, wrapping a compression bandage tightly under her arm and over her shoulder to secure the dressing. "Did you crash? Where's your vehicle?" "Ran me off the ridge," she stammered, coughing up a terrifying speck of blood. "Black SUV. They shot into the car. I crawled up the embankment." Silas quickly checked her back. The bullet had exited cleanly through her shoulder blade, miraculously missing the subclavian artery, but the blood loss was severe. Worse, her abdomen was rock hard. The trauma of the crash and the gunshot had triggered something far more dangerous. Silas, Chloe whimpered, clutching his wrist with a surprisingly strong grip. My water. It just broke. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 2 a.m. The storm outside had escalated into a chaotic symphony of cracking thunder and howling winds. But inside the cabin the tension was thick enough to suffocate. Silas had moved Chloe to his heavy oak dining table, the most sterile and elevated surface available. He had built up the fire to a roaring blaze to combat her hypothermia, hanging heavy wool blankets over the windows to block the light from spinning out into the dark forest. If the men in the black SUV were still looking for her, Silas wasn't about to provide a beacon. Breathe, Chloe. Nice and slow, Silas instructed, wiping her sweat-drenched forehead with a cool cloth. It hurts. Ah, she screamed, gripping the edges of the table until her knuckles turned white. It's too early. It's too early for the baby. Babies have their own schedules, Silas said, maintaining a mask of absolute calm, though his mind was racing. He was equipped for trauma, not a premature wilderness delivery. He had boiled water, sterilized his instruments with iodine, and laid out clamps and surgical scissors. Between agonizing contractions, Chloe spoke in fragmented sentences, unraveling the nightmare that had brought her to his door. Tommy Callahan's charter had recently pushed out a rival syndicate, a vicious cartel offshoot running narcotics through Flagstaff. The cartel had promised retaliation, not against the bikers, but against their families. Chloe had been driving back from a prenatal appointment in Phoenix when the black SUV ambushed her on Route 89. They didn't just want to kill her. They wanted to erase Tommy's heir to send a devastating message. Tommy told me to carry this, she whispered weakly, gesturing to a small blood-smeared satellite communicator attached to her belt loop. I pressed the SOS button when the car went off the cliff. But the storm, I don't know if the signal went through. Focus on the pain, Chloe. Push it into your hands, not your head, Silas instructed as another brutal contraction seized her body. Suddenly, Barnaby let out a low, menacing growl from his spot by the fireplace. The dog's ears twitched, swiveling toward the front of the cabin. Silas's blood ran cold. The storm was deafening, but Barnaby's hearing was sharper than any tempest. Silas stood, grabbing the heavy Colt M1911 pistol he kept locked in a drawer, racking the slide with a sharp metallic clack. Don't make a sound, Silas whispered to Chloe. He crept toward the front window, peeling back a millimeter of the wool blanket. Through the torrential rain, two beams of bright white light pierced the darkness of the forest. A vehicle was slowly creeping up his long, muddy driveway. It wasn't an ambulance. It was a black, heavily tinted SUV. They had followed her blood trail. Silas's mind snapped back to the jungles of Vietnam. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating survival instinct. He looked at Chloe, who was biting her own lip to keep from crying out through a contraction. Stay here, Silas murmured. He unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the covered porch, tucking the Colt behind his back, hidden under his oversized flannel shirt. The SUV stopped a few yards from the porch. Two men stepped out. They wore expensive dark raincoats, completely out of place in the rugged Arizona wilderness. One of them held a high-powered flashlight. The other casually gripped a suppressed submachine gun, partially hidden by his coat. Evening, old man. The one with the flashlight called out, his voice fighting the wind. The beam hit Silas squarely in the eyes. Silas squinted, adopting the posture of a frail, confused hermit. He let his shoulders slump and put on a bewildered, toothy expression. Who's there? If you're selling magazines, it's a damn awful time for it. The armed man stepped closer, his eyes scanning the muddy porch. We had a little accident down the ridge. A woman ran off the road, blonde, pregnant. We're trying to help her. Have you seen her? Woman. Silas cupped his hand to his ear, playing deaf. Only woman around here was my Helen. God rest her soul. You boys are lost. The highway is back that way. The flashlight beams swept downward, illuminating the wooden planks of the porch. The heavy rain had washed away most of Chloe's blood, but a faint pinkish smear remained near the doorframe. The man with the light paused, focusing the beam on the spot. What's that on the floor, Grandpa? The man asked, his tone dropping its friendly facade, turning deadly cold. Silas didn't hesitate. That's where I gutted a buck yesterday morning. Now, if you boys don't mind, I'm missing my radio shows. The armed man took a step up the stairs. Mind if we take a look inside, just to be sure? Silas's posture instantly changed. The frail hermit vanished. He stood tall, leveling the heavy barrel of the Colt 1911 directly at the armed man's chest. The hammer was cocked, Silas's finger resting lightly on the trigger. "I mind," Silas said, his voice booming with the authority of a military commander. "This is private property. Under Arizona's castle doctrine, you take one more step up these stairs with that weapon, and I will paint these pines with your brains. Now get off my land." The two men froze. They looked at the massive handgun, then at the unwavering, icy stare of the old man holding it. Silas's hands weren't shaking. He held the gun with the absolute stillness of a man who had pulled the trigger before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. The man with the flashlight sneered, patting his partner's shoulder. "Let's go. She's probably bleeding out in a ditch, anyway." They backed away, climbing into the SUV. Silas didn't lower his weapon until the tail lights disappeared down the muddy driveway. He rushed back inside, locking the door. "Silas!" Chloe screamed, unable to hold it in any longer. "It's time. The baby is coming." The next 4 hours were a blur of blood, sweat, and sheer willpower. Silas leaned on every ounce of his medical training. Chloe was weak, her body battered by the gunshot and the horrific crash, but she pushed with a primal, desperate strength. Just as the first gray light of dawn began to peek through the cracks in the window coverings, the cabin was filled with a sound that overpowered the dying storm. It was the sharp, healthy cry of a newborn baby. Silas cut the cord, clearing the infant's airways before wrapping him in a warm, sterile towel. It was a boy, small, premature, but breathing fiercely. He gently placed the crying infant on Chloe's chest. Tears streamed down her exhausted, pale face as she kissed the baby's head. "Thank you," she sobbed, looking at Silas as if he were an angel. "Thank you." Silas smiled, exhausted, sinking into a wooden rocking chair. The bleeding in her shoulder had stopped. The baby was healthy. Against all odds, they had survived the night. By 7 a.m., the rain had completely stopped. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting golden rays through the dripping pine needles. Silas stood up to make a pot of coffee, his bones aching with every movement. But as he reached for the coffee tin began to rattle. Then the cups on the shelves rattled. The heavy cast iron skillet on the stove vibrated. Barnaby jumped up, whining nervously. Silas frowned. It felt like an earthquake. A low, rhythmic rumbling vibrated through the floorboards, growing louder by the second. It sounded like rolling thunder, but the sky was clear. At the front of the pack, a massive man with a thick black beard and eyes like crushed coal cut his engine. He wore the president patch. It was Tommy Callahan. And as Tommy dismounted his bike, unholstering a massive revolver from his hip and staring daggers at Silas's front door, the old medic realized something terrifying. The bikers didn't know he had saved Chloe's life. They only knew her distress beacon had pinged at this exact coordinate right before she disappeared. To the Hells Angels, Silas wasn't a savior. He was the prime suspect. Silas's combat-trained mind calculated the grim reality of the situation. There was no back door. There was no talking his way out if things went south. 800 heavily armed, fiercely loyal outlaws were parked on his front lawn, and their leader looked ready to burn the entire forest to the ground to find his family. "Silas, what is it?" Chloe asked, her voice weak from the exhaustion of labor. She tried to sit up, clutching her newborn son to her chest, but winced in agony. "Stay out of sight," Silas commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." Leaving the heavy Colt M1911 on the kitchen counter, Silas knew a weapon would only guarantee his immediate execution. He unbolted the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the porch, raising his empty hands to show he was unarmed. The silence that followed was more deafening than the roar of the engines. One by one, in a cascading wave of mechanical clicks, 800 Harley-Davidson engines were killed. The sudden quiet of the morning forest felt suffocating, broken only by the heavy, synchronized thud of leather boots hitting the muddy driveway. Tommy Callahan bypassed the wooden stairs entirely, stepping up onto the porch with a predator's grace. Up close, the Hells Angels president was a terrifying spectacle. Intricate tattoos crawled up his neck, and a small diamond-shaped patch on his lapel read, "Filthy Few." a notorious underworld moniker rumored to be earned only by those who had killed for the club. In his right hand, he held a massive .44 Magnum revolver, its barrel pointed directly at Silas's chest. Directly behind Tommy stood his vice president, a massive, scarred man known to law enforcement as Boone Harrison. Boone was dragging something, or rather, someone, by the collar of an expensive dark raincoat. Silas's eyes narrowed. It was the man with the flashlight from the black SUV. The cartel hitman's face was battered, bloodied, and swollen shut, but he was alive. My wife's SOS beacon pinged exactly 50 yards from this porch. Tommy growled, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated with barely contained rage. We caught this piece of cartel trash trying to limp his busted SUV down the mountain road. Now you're going to tell me exactly what happened to Chloe, or I swear to God, old man, I will peel the skin off your bones. Before Silas could speak, the bleeding cartel hitman spat a mouthful of blood onto the wooden planks and let out a manic, desperate laugh. I told you, Callahan. The hitman wheezed, desperate to deflect the biker's wrath. We chased her here, but he got to her first. She was banging on his door, and he shot her. We heard her screaming inside. The old man finished her off. Tommy's eyes widened, the grief and rage twisting his features into something demonic. He pressed the cold steel barrel of the .44 Magnum directly into the center of Silas's forehead. The click of the hammer being pulled back echoed sharply across the quiet mountain. Behind Tommy, hundreds of bikers shifted, hands resting on hunting knives, chains, and holstered firearms. The air crackled with lethal intent. You have 5 seconds to give me a reason not to pull this trigger, Tommy whispered, a single tear escaping his cold eyes. Silas did not flinch. His heart rate remained steady. He looked past the gun, locking eyes with Tommy. If I had wanted to kill her son, I wouldn't have wasted hours sterilizing surgical scissors, Silas stated calmly, his voice unwavering. She's inside. She took a bullet to the shoulder and she lost a lot of blood, but she's alive. Tommy's breathing hitched. You're lying. I was a combat medic in the Ia Drang Valley and an ER nurse at Cook County General for 3 decades, Silas continued, ignoring the gun against his skull. I know how to stop a hemorrhage, and I know how to deliver a baby. Tommy lowered the gun a fraction of an inch, the words striking him like a physical blow. Baby? Your son, Silas said softly. Born about 2 hours ago. Now take that gun out of my face, wipe your boots, and come inside. But if you bring that violent energy into my home and scare her, I'll take that revolver and beat you with it. Boone stepped forward, enraged by the disrespect shown to his president. Watch your mouth, old man. Stand down, Boone. Tommy barked, his voice cracking. He holstered his weapon, his massive chest heaving as he stared at the wooden door. He turned to Boone, pointing at the cartel hitman on the ground. Tie him to the back of my bike. If this old man is lying, we burn this cabin to the foundation. Tommy stepped past Silas, pushing the heavy oak door open. The scene inside the cabin looked like the aftermath of a massacre. To Tommy's eyes, it was a nightmare. The kitchen table was slick with drying blood. Blood-soaked towels were piled in the corner. Steel surgical clamps and a pair of bloody forceps sat in a stainless steel bowl of iodine on the counter. The metallic smell of copper hung heavy in the warm air. Tommy froze in the entryway, his massive frame shaking. For a terrifying second, he believed the cartel hitman had told the truth. Then a tiny, high-pitched wail broke the silence. Tommy's head snapped toward the living room. There, lying on Silas's plush sofa, near the roaring fireplace, was Chloe. She was incredibly pale, and 4-line, fashioned from Silas's trauma kit, was taped to her arm. A heavy compression bandage wrapped securely over her right shoulder. But she was awake, smiling weakly, and cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in a blue plaid blanket. Tommy, she whispered, tears spilling over her cheeks. The ruthless, hardened president of the Hells Angels dropped to his knees. The fearsome outlaw, a man who commanded hundreds of violent men and struck terror into rival syndicates, completely broke down. He crawled the last few feet to the sofa, burying his face in Chloe's uninjured shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. Silas watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame, allowing the family their moment. He saved us, Tommy, Chloe cried, running her hand through her husband's thick hair. The Navarro cartel. They ran me off the road. They shot me. I dragged myself here. This man, Silas, he fought them off. He stood on the porch with a gun and told them to go to hell. Then he delivered our boy. Tommy slowly pulled back, looking down at the tiny red-faced infant sleeping against his mother's chest. He reached out a massive tattooed finger, and the newborn instinctively wrapped his tiny hand around it. After several long minutes, Tommy stood up. The tears were gone, replaced by a look of overwhelming, profound gratitude. He walked back to the entryway where Silas was standing. Tommy didn't say a word. He reached out, wrapping his massive arms around the elderly man in a crushing embrace. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." Tommy choked out, stepping back and looking Silas squarely in the eye. "My life, my blood, it's yours. Just take care of them," Silas replied, a tired smile touching his lips. "And maybe keep your friends off the grass. I just reseeded the front lawn." Tommy let out a sharp, breathless laugh. He walked back out onto the porch, looking out at the sea of leather-clad bikers waiting in anxious silence. "She's alive," Tommy roared, raising his fists into the air. "I have a son." The forest erupted. 800 men cheered, a deafening roar of triumph that echoed off the mountain peaks. Bikers hugged each other, revved their engines, and fired celebratory warning shots into the dirt. Tommy turned his attention to the cartel hitman, who was now trembling uncontrollably on the ground, realizing his lie had been exposed. "Boone," Tommy said, his voice instantly returning to the cold, merciless tone of a cartel rival. "Load this piece of trash into the van. Tell the rest of the charters in Phoenix and Tucson we are going to war. The Navarro cartel ends today." Over the next few hours, the cabin transformed. A specialized transport van driven by club members arrived to carefully move Chloe and the baby to a highly secure private medical facility in Phoenix. Before Tommy left, he pulled a thick brass challenge coin from his vest and pressed it into Silas's palm. The coin bore the Hells Angels' death head insignia on one side and Tommy's personal charter crest on the other. "You show this to any man wearing our patch anywhere in the world, and they will lay down their lives for you," Tommy said fiercely. "You are protected, Silas. Always." In the weeks that followed, the local news was dominated by reports of a massive underworld war. The Navarro cartel's operations in northern Arizona were systematically and brutally dismantled. Hideouts were raided, narcotic shipments were intercepted, and key cartel lieutenants mysteriously vanished. Law enforcement was baffled by the sudden, highly organized eradication of the syndicate, but Silas knew exactly who was responsible. As for Silas, his quiet off-the-grid life returned to normal, with one major exception. He was no longer truly alone. Every Sunday morning, without fail, a rotation of 2 Hells Angels would ride up his muddy driveway, drop off a week's worth of premium groceries, bags of dog food for Barnaby, and a fresh bundle of firewood. When a blizzard knocked out his generator in late January, a crew of 6 bikers arrived within 2 hours with a brand-new industrial-grade power system, installing it in the freezing snow while Silas drank coffee inside. No trespassers, hunters, or lost travelers ever accidentally wandered onto his property again. The local off-road trails suddenly bore subtle, menacing signs warning outsiders to turn back. Silas Pendleton had moved to the wilderness to find peace, leaving behind a lifetime of saving people. He never expected to be dragged back into the bloody reality of the world. But as he sat on his porch months later watching Barnaby play in the yard while a massive, heavily tattooed biker respectfully chopped firewood in the distance, Silas couldn't help but smile. He had saved 2 lives that stormy night. In return, he had gained an army of guardians. Did Silas's incredible bravery and this unbelievable twist of fate leave you on the edge of your seat? If you love this real-life story of courage, survival, and unexpected brotherhood, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling true-to-life stories that prove heroes come in all forms. Drop a comment below on what you would have done in Silas's shoes.